Blackballed. 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 Blackballed.
What is up, everybody? My name is James D. Fiore, and this is Blackballed. I thought it would be fitting to put the Beasts of England soundtrack from George Orwell's Animal Farm there. One, because it's copyright free, and I won't get busted for using it. And the second is because I have been describing the Trudeau government's quest to be the most Orwellian Western government on the planet through their Bill C-10, Bill C-11, and Bill C-18 as the most Orwellian example I can think of. And there are lots of people, and myself included, I'm not going to lie, who I have a hard time wrapping my head around this bill for so many different reasons. And I find that the fallback excuse for this government is always about Canadian content. But really the problem might be how Canadian content is defined. So in order to help me sort of weed through all of these different types of scenarios, I have two guests today. One is a professor from the University of Ottawa, and his name is Michael Geist. And hey, Michael, how you doing?
I'm doing well.
And I think I'm just going to because he's here, I hope that's okay with everybody. Washington Post columnist JJ McCulloiugh is also here. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. How are you guys?
Hey, not too bad.
Yeah, doing well.
Michael, I'm going to start with you. Why is it that so many people have so much trouble trying to figure out what the government is doing here? And is that intentional?
It's a good place to start. I guess I'd say that part of the reason is that what the government says it wants to do and what the legislation actually does are two different things. So the government says that it wants to bring the large internet streaming services, the Netflix and Disneys of the world, into the Canadian broadcast system. I think there's a reasonable debate to be had around those issues about the true state of film and TV production in Canada right now and whether there's a concern and an emergency taking place. But regardless, I mean, that certainly was their stated objective. And then along the way, the government from the last bill, and then it's carried over into this bill, expanded the scope really of this legislation to include user content. And by moving into that world, essentially going from purely large curated services to these uncurated services where we see so many Canadians and so many others creating, and the prospect that is brought into the ambit of regulation, I think is what has caused considerable amount of concern, and where there have been at times real debates as to what the true intent or at least the true effect of the legislation would be.
Yeah, and there seems to be how do you define Canadian content? We've talked about this before, but people don't seem to understand that Canadian content doesn't sound what it means, what it's in, not what it's intended to sound like, because it's intended to be something specific. But we tend to think of Canadian content as, if the production company is owned by Canadian, or if the content itself is Canadian-centric and culturally relevant. But how does the government actually define what Canadian content is?
Yeah, it's another good place to really start and take the conversation a bit. And I think that promoters or supporters of the CanCon system, including the government, have tended to frame it largely around what they would describe as promoting Canadian stories. We've actually heard this a lot during hearings on the bill that have taken place over the last couple of weeks, where there are those who are supportive of this legislation will say, we simply won't get Canadian stories if we don't have this kind of legislation in place. I think part of the problem with that position is that once you start drilling down into what this system of CanCon actually means, it turns out that it didn't have to be a Canadian story at all. And in fact, some of the supporters have now acknowledged that, yeah, it's true. The Canadian content rules don't require a Canadian story. In fact, in some ways, CanCon rules are trying to do several things, and I don't know that they do any of them very well. There's an element of so-called telling Canadian stories, but in the kind of tick box exercise that exists that seek to identify what counts as Canadian content, oftentimes it has very little to do with what we might define as a Canadian story. Sometimes it's about economics, saying that we want to ensure that more Canadians are employed in film and television production. But there too, the CanCon rules don't really work very well because we've seen a huge proliferation of employment in the area. It's record amounts of people working in the sector, but oftentimes they work on productions that don't count. And then the third area is intellectual property ownership. It's got to be owned by Canadians. And the problem there is it's pretty tough to bring in services like Netflix and Disney and say, well, you've got to pay into the system, but you can't actually own anything that you've paid for.
Which is awesome and totally frustrating. It also, JJ, I wanted to have you on the show as well, because I really enjoy your tweets on this subject. I'm just going to go through a couple of them right now. I don't often post overtly opinionated content on my YouTube channel because it is not a commentary channel, and I'm sensitive to the diversity of my audience. But my last two videos bashing C-11 have gotten amazing response. No one on the left, right, or center supports this bill. You've been following this bill and the stories that have been written by it. I mean, I feel the same way that you do. It's like our first sort of unifying force is how much most people hate this bill. Yeah. Michael has sort of outlined how the policy interacts with some of the rules or whatever. As a YouTuber, as a person who puts content out on a regular basis, and you're a popular guy as well, what kind of fears do you have if this bill passes?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of fear, and I think that probably the defining fear is just the fear of uncertainty. There is a lot of ambiguity as to how a bill that aspires to do the things that this bill claims that it wants to do, such as elevate Canadian content on a platform like YouTube, improve the quote unquote discoverability of Canadian content on a platform like YouTube. And there also is like some weird language as well that the CRTC in the future will have a mandate to sort of stipulate the the breakdown of different genres of content, which is a sort of giant question mark as well. So I think the fear is basically that, YouTube has been a tremendously successful 17-year experiment for thousands of Canadians like me who have made a living creating YouTube content. And the idea that government is now just going to kind of intrude into this space, impose a bunch of new rules and regulations that could possibly dramatically affect the livelihoods and business model of people like me who have grown up understanding YouTube in one particular way, but now we're going to have to deal with this brand new sort of like newly regulated YouTube. And YouTube is not an easy platform to work for at the best of times. There's a lot of sort of mysterious under the hood stuff that goes on in how YouTube chooses to promote or elevate or, suppress various forms of content on the platform. The concept of being buried as a YouTuber is something that a lot of YouTubers are well familiar with. YouTubers tear their hair out all the time, not quite understanding why a video is popular or a flop, even though they feel like maybe they've been doing everything right. And so the idea that now there's going to be this added layer of ambiguity once sort of the CRTC starts regulating the platform as well and starts, in theory, putting its finger on the scale in order to improve, the discoverability of Canadian content, whatever that is interpreted or redefined to mean. It's a time of great nervousness and worry for a lot of Canadian YouTubers, of whom there is no shortage. And that's like the other important point. There is no problem here in terms of not enough Canadian content as most normal people would define it on YouTube. There are over 100 Canadian YouTubers that have more than 3.5 million subscribers. This has been a tremendous, highly successful growth industry for Canadian creators of all walks of life, of all genres of content. And so the idea that this is just a classic example of government trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah, Michael, I've heard you say similar things. And I'm reminded of a Simpsons quote, because that's how my brain works, where Homer's like, to alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. I feel that way about algorithms. I feel like we're so enamored with this idea that AI, or a sort of beta version of AI, or whatever you want to call it, is telling us what we like the fashion industry, the way the fashion industry dictates the taste and doesn't ask us what we think they should make us wear. They tell us this is what's cool. I have such a big problem with that. I feel like algorithms are really the only thing I ever want to talk about. And I just want to, like on Twitter, I have turned off the algorithm on my newsfeed and I get the newest tweet. I'm totally fine with that, because if I want to find something, I'll seek it out. Michael, is there a contingent of MPs who are critics of this bill who are speaking about algorithms in the same way that I am, but we're lettered, hopefully?
It's certainly an issue that's come up, and it's one of those issues actually where you see people on both sides. On the one hand, the committee's been assured that this bill won't allow the CRTC to touch algorithms, and on the other hand, they've had witnesses that appeared before committee that say the CRTC must get involved in some of these algorithmic choices, that we can't allow a YouTube or a TikTok to be making these kinds of decisions, or if they are, we should recognize that those algorithms are making those kinds of choices, and that they would argue that it's perfectly acceptable to have the CRTC make some of those choices instead. I have to say that I thought that one of the people who's made the most amount of sense on this issue, she appeared before committee, she came on my podcast actually as well, is Morgan Fortier, who is one of Canada's most successful runs one of Canada's most successful YouTube companies, where they've got hundreds of millions of billions of views and tens of millions of subscribers. And, her view was that these algorithmic issues, or this discussion, really misses so much of the point, that in fact, the kind of data that's used is widely accepted by the branding community, by advertisers, by many others. And so the idea that we're somehow even engaged in a debate as to whether this counts for anything or not, really kind of misses the reality that whole sectors of the economy have built themselves up around some of these issues. And while I think there's definitely room for greater transparency around the algorithmic choices that these companies are making, I think that, frankly, not necessarily purely from a YouTube perspective, but more broadly for social media and others, where there are clear privacy and data governance implications around some of these choices. And we would do well, I think, to have a better understanding about how some of those choices are made. That's a far cry from effectively saying that a government regulator like the CRTC can somehow do it better. I don't think there's really any evidence to suggest that they can, or, as you were just highlighting, that there's really a problem here worth fixing. Just quickly, the CRTC chair, Ian Scott, who confirmed that the bill does include the power to regulate over these issues, was at pains to say, don't worry, I'm not really going to do very much. We just want to make sure that someone who wants to find Canadian content can do so on even a service like a Netflix. And I was really tempted to ask whether or not he even has a Netflix subscription, because it's not terribly difficult to type the word Canada or Canadian into the service, and you're presented with a whole menu of that content. So it comes back to that question, what is the problem on some, especially around discoverability, that the government is trying to solve?
JJ? Because I could see nodding.
It's absolutely the case, right? Like, the fact is, like, I can only speak to YouTube because that's my realm of work. But like I said, some of the most successful Canadian celebrities in the world right now, certainly in the eyes of young people, are YouTubers, right? There is no shortage of tremendous success stories that have arisen through this medium, and have achieved just great, tremendous things. And they've made all sorts of content, right? Like, I am a YouTuber who actually does tell, like, overtly Canadian stories. I've made videos about Canadian history and politics and, food and pop culture and all sorts of things. And, I have over 750,000 subscribers, right? Like, I'm a case study. And, like, I don't like to use myself too much as an example, because that sort of seems somewhat self-indulgent. But, like, I'm a case study of a guy who just in an unregulated medium said, I'm going to talk about Canadian stuff. and I'm going to sort of sink or swim on that. And I've been tremendously successful. This is how I make my living. This is how I make my income. There have been Canadians who have made less overtly Canadian content than I do. You know, people that have been in the fitness realm or the do-it-yourself realm, or, you know, cooking or video game reviews or movie reviews or whatever, and have been tremendously successful too. So it's when I was at the committee last week, and, you know, I was hearing sort of the testimony of some of those sort of the established interests, you know, they all speak as if this is some sort of great crisis of content, or even like a crisis of national sovereignty or cultural integrity. Like, you know, that the nation is sort of collapsing in the face of these, you know, evil American tech giants. And I just think there's just very little evidence to support that. I mean, maybe there's like a corporate anxiety that, you know, some of the old legacy media worries that they're losing the ground game to new media like YouTube. But, you know, beyond that, beyond just a kind of like naked appeal to like corporate self-interest and sort of a loss of profits and a loss of eyeballs, like there's really no case to be made. And I think that's why it has proven to be such a enormously unpersuasive bill to the vast majority of Canadians who are even aware of it. You know, when I posted videos or write articles about it, it is striking to me. I'm seen as a somewhat controversial figure, but never in my life have I had a take that has been so universally sympathized with than my anti-C-11 take.
Yeah, if I could just.
Well, I've heard
just
you
quickly
say
jump
almost
into-
thinking that. Yeah, please go. Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to because to a couple of things JJ said, which I think is absolutely right. First, this is not a partisan, or ought not to be a partisan issue in terms of left or right. And so I think the kind of response that he's received is reflective of that. You know, there are YouTubers, there are TikTokers, there are people creating content of all sorts that are on the left and that they're on the right. And what brings them together is this view in many ways that this is just an inappropriate attempt by the government to get directly involved in this kind of regulation. Again, we're talking specifically around this question of user content regulation, because it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I have to say that his comment about some of the legacy media, JJ's comment there, really strikes a chord with some of the things that the committee's heard. You know, to me, one of the most astonishing things that we've heard doesn't involve user content. It involved Bell coming before committee and saying that their solution to solve the CanCon issue was to ensure that they had better access to cheap US content, and calling on the government to insert provisions in the law that would better guarantee that they could get that cheap US content, which they could then fill up their programming schedule with as a way to monetize that. And they said that would then help fund CanCon. You know, what's striking is just there's crickets from the various groups that say that they're all about producing more Canadian content. And yet when the country's largest broadcaster gets up there and says, well, what we really need is more US content, they seemingly have nothing to say.
Yeah, I saw that. I think it was from that article from the report. Bill C-11 will ensure that the streamers for the first time start contributing to their fair share. Right away, I'm just like, fuck this article. Like, because wasn't it you? I'm not even going to read the rest because wasn't it, because it says basically what you just said, but wasn't it you, Michael, that said the last time you were on a show that if they, like, Netflix already contributes how many millions of dollars to our economy? Why can't they just designate that money to CanCon? Like, why do we need to change everything? That's been a huge part of the story. Yeah, you know what? You're absolutely right. That's been a big part of the story. We've had a number of groups, including the largest entertainment union in the country, talk about the fact that it's the studios, US studios and streamers that are responsible for more than half the employment right now in film and TV production in Canada, contributing billions of dollars. Disney has said that before this committee that Canada's top 4 worldwide for where they produce. Netflix has said Canada is top 3 worldwide where they produce. And Netflix talked about spending more than $3 billion in Canada on production and licensing since they entered into the market. It is pretty tough to make the case that there's a significant problem when you've got streamers talking about billions of dollars being invested in the country, and somehow the government says, well, that's not quite enough. Yeah, Michael Geist, I know you have to go, but thank you for joining us. I really appreciate your basically your wisdom on this matter. You're like my Yoda when it comes to this kind of shit, so I appreciate that. And thank you. We'll have you back soon. Thanks, Michael. Hey, thanks so much for having me. Take care. Thank you. From a content producer perspective, what would change? Like, what is the worst case scenario for in your position? You have 750,000 subscribers. This is how you make your living. I know you write a column for the Wash House, but I'm pretty sure if you only had that job, you'd be below the poverty line because it's media. That's how it's
They
done
pay
these
pretty
days.
well. I won't.
Yeah,
dig
no,
too much on that. But yeah,
I know it's not the Toronto Star. I keep on getting confused. But how? What is the worst case scenario for your position on what you're doing now and what it could turn into if all of these 11 and C-18 actually pass?
Yeah. So I mean, I think, and people have pointed this out to me, is that I actually might be arguing against my own interests here, because as I said earlier, I actually do produce content that I think is quite overtly Canadian by any meaningful definition. You know, I do make a lot of videos that talk explicitly about Canadian things, politics and history and so on, and I'm obviously a Canadian, and I don't have a sort of cast of other people involved with my production whose national credentials could be called into question. So but I worry very much for other creators, and I'm doing this, you know, mostly I'm sort of motivated by their interests more than I think my own self-interest, which is to say that, like, if the worst case scenario happens for, like, say, if we just imagine a Canadian YouTuber who does videos about Thai food recipes, and there is such a Canadian YouTuber, right? So like, say, like, you know, she makes videos about Thai food recipes, and then sort of the CRTC comes along and sort of says, well, it's lovely that you're making these cooking videos that are enjoyed by, you know, millions of people around the world, but we've decided that that's not Canadian enough to be promoted by this new kind of algorithm that we're going to bring in. So we are going to, like, suppress the discoverability of your content, which is not Canadian enough, and we're going to elevate the content of somebody whose content is Canadian enough, say JJ, right? Or say the CBC might even be a better example, or CTV, or Global, or one of these old guard media institutions that knows how to play the CanCon game, that knows how to get Canadian content certified, you know, to actually be, and this is actually literally the term they use, to be certified as officially Canadian, you know, and then that content gets boosted. That content is at the top of your page when you log into youtube.com. You know, you suddenly see all of this, you know, properly accredited Canadian content. And then when you go to search for something, that accredited content floods to the top, and then the other content sort of floods to the bottom, and it's much harder to discover organically. And then for this theoretical Thai food channel, she suddenly discovers that her views are going way down, her revenues are going way down, and that she's struggling to make a living in a platform that has now been rigged to promote certain types of content over others. And I think that's really the doomsday scenario for a lot of creators. And when I talk to creators, that's what they say. They worry a great deal that their content is not going to be seen as Canadian enough to be boosted by whatever regime the CRTC brings in to determine, you know, the basically the patriotic credentials of the work that you're making. Like, I think that there's a lot of creators who could be very, as I said earlier, right? Like, we already live under the uncertainty of YouTube's own algorithm, which can be very fussy and difficult to predict. So the idea of now having to navigate an entirely new algorithm that has some sort of patriotic greater good as its motivating, you know, sort of factor, that's really troubling, I think, for a lot of creators.
And we're alone on this as far as Western nations go.
Yes.
There is not another Western country who has like a CRTC type thing. The FCC in the United States isn't quite like the CRTC, right? They're more about, they're not content driven. They're decency driven, aren't they, for lack of better words?
Yeah, and it isn't content driven. Although it is interesting that there actually is a case study as far as this goes. Like, the Congress passed a rule or a law, I should say, some time ago, regarding how online content can be sort of promoted to youth and to young people, like to children, and the role of sort of children in online video content. So to this day, every time I go to upload a video, I have to click a little button that says there are no minors in this video, and this video is not being marketed to children, right? So like that's kind of like permanent aspect of sort of the YouTube infrastructure that is a result of government intervention. It's obviously not that severe. It hasn't impacted my bottom line. It has impacted the bottom line of creators who previously worked with sort of child-centric content. But the point is that I often often see people sort of say like, well, this seems too ambitious. This could not actually be done. Like practically, this would be impossible to implement. But I'm very skeptical of that. I think that we already have a precedent, as I just cited, in which YouTube has been forced under penalty of law to introduce some sort of new sorting mechanism for determining the content. Every time you go to upload a video, you also have to like, self certify that there's no sex or violence or, blah, 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 right? That's mostly done for the benefit of advertisers, but you do have to self-certify. And that if YouTube discovers that you're lying on those self-certifications, there are consequences for your channel as well. It makes it harder for you to get approved for advertisements, which then hurts your bottom line and so forth. So I think like it's worth taking this kind of stuff seriously because it could be implemented. Well, and presumably it will be implemented if this law is passed. And I do think it will. I mean, I've seen no reason to believe that it will not involve the content of the videos in addition to merely the nationality of the person that's making it. There is language in Bill C-11 that makes reference to, as I said earlier, the CRTC's mandate to promote certain genres of video, which I think is very troubling. And there is also sort of like a lot of kind of politically correct sort of sensibilities in the bill as well that makes it seem pretty clear to me that the video or that the government imagines this regulation as at least being partially motivated by ideological or political motives to present certain kinds of content that they view as being more diverse or more healthy for the citizenry in some way. So yeah, there's a great deal of things to be legitimately very worried about.
That's part of like, I didn't realize that I was so conservative. Came to my views on the CRTC. I just didn't follow CRTC and that stuff until I started podcasting a couple years ago, and then I was like, why are we doing this? why are we so afraid that our citizens will be culturally bankrupt by not seeing what the latest French harpist from Quebec City is doing? Like grant system. Yeah, there we go. That's what the grant system should be called. Like that's because I'm like, they are saying that we're trying to like continue to feed our grant system so artists create content and our culture will be protected.
Yeah.
It reminded me of Put America First, that Trump legislation, I believe it was, where it was like America First, I think it was. It feels like nationalism or something. Like I don't know why we're so afraid. Let us choose our own shit. Like, if they force feed it, by the way, not going to be all of a sudden be like, oh, it is good. Of The Littlest Hobo is exactly what I need. Like, no one is saying it.
No, I mean, like it's been a tremendous failure, right? Like the CRTC has been, and the sort of CanCon regime has been something that the federal government has been trying to fix the country with for, I don't know, like 50, 60 years or so. And they have remarkably little to show for it. I mean, obviously you do have your isolated case study of a successful Canadian television show or movie here or there, but the vast majority of them have been enormous flops. Right. The vast majority of Canadians have wanted to consume American media or, other international media because it's generally better or because it is not made with this kind of narrow nationalistic agenda. It's made from the premise of let's make something that's entertaining and accessible to the broadest possible audience. I think that's basically how Canadian YouTubers have made success for themselves as well. They don't go into it thinking like, what is in the patriotic greatest good to make? They think, no, what do people want to watch and what could be broadly accessible? They have a very sort of like, evil American kind of mindset in that way. And they're thinking in a kind of capitalistic way, like, what does my audience want? And not only like, what do the Canadian audience want, but can I make content that is universal enough that perhaps it can have an international appeal as well? And that's why I think you get a lot of successful Canadian YouTubers who talk about stuff like cooking or fitness or video games or stuff like that. That's not kind of in some sort of narrowly nationalistic box. The tragedy and the cynicism that has always sort of underlined the CanCon regime is that you have some creators in this country, musicians and film directors and TV stars and actors and writers and so forth, who just feel entitled to success. Like they feel that they want to be successful movie or film or musician makers, and that they somehow feel that if they cannot be successful in a free market, it is somehow government's job to rush to their rescue with bailouts and a rigged airwaves system to promote their content over others. And that's unfortunately what I think is often really kind of driving this at the end of the day. You look at these kind of lobby groups that have been testifying at committee, and they are representing, in many cases, like people that are just not that successful in the creative realm, people that cannot produce content that is popular on its own merits, that does not have a natural audience, and yet they nevertheless feel entitled to success. And I just really have never understood why it is the job of taxpayers to subsidize somebody's failed artistic creative dream. Nobody else gets those kind of bailouts, or at least they shouldn't. I mean, I know that there are bailouts and subsidies for all sorts of failed industries in this country, but I mean, that really riles me. And I think it riles a lot of people that have, certainly in my space, in the YouTube space, that have been successful making content that is broadly popular with Canadians and an international audience. And the idea that somehow now we are the people that need to be punished in order to prop up the failures of other people who perhaps aren't quite as savvy in producing content that is broadly popular or resonant with audiences.
I completely agree with everything you said, and since I've been trying to educate myself on this stuff, I've been learning. So I told a story in a podcast I think 2 weeks ago, and it's a true story. I was living in the annex in Toronto, and neighbor was this woman, and her boyfriend or whatever played the harp, and got like 85 grand in a grant to make a harp album, which, by the way, like fucking 85 grand and literally he just played the harp. There was no other instrumentation. I don't know, whatever. Anyways, so money, and like a year goes by or something. You'd think it would take a harpist like a few days to cut a harp album, but I guess not. And when it went on sale, because I was living beside this couple, I guess for like 3.5 years before I left. A couple months before I left, because I moved away. How many albums did you sell? And he's like, like 60. So we had 85 grand to give this man enough money to make his harp album. And by the way, a male harp player just seems weird. But anyways, he sold like 60 copies, which works out to what, like $1,400 or something like that a copy. Yeah. We don't do it right. Whatever it is that we're doing, Go ahead.
It's offensive on multiple levels, right? Like, because it's not, there's nothing more validating and empowering and, gratifying, like as a creator, to realize that you are successful and that you are popular and that what you are making is resonant with an audience, right? It's a tremendous feeling. It's what we as creators all live for, right? And the idea that I just feel like it would be a kind of just such a hollow thing to be so heavily subsidized and to create a product that ultimately just still fails, right? Like to have government holding your hand all the way along, propping you up with a rigged, airwaves or, discoverability or whatever, giving you all this money, and then your product still doesn't succeed. And it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be propped up by government and still be rejected by the public that you ostensibly are in this business to serve in some way? Like, it just seems like a very hollow sort of victory. And in the YouTube context, I think it could actually backfire. And actually other YouTubers have observed this as well, that if you promote content that people don't want to watch, if this sort of like pops up in your feed, your subscription feed, your discoverability tab, your searches and so forth, it can provoke like a great deal of backlash, where I can imagine a scenario in which people start, angrily commenting, why is this always in my feed? Why are YouTube trying to make me watch this video? I don't want to see this. Yeah. And they get angry and cross and crabby, and I'm sure we can all think of examples in which this has happened in the television realm. Like I remember when I was in university, there was this show that the CBC made called Arctic Air. And it was about like an airline in the Northwest Territories, a great sort of Canadian story. And there was like billboards for it everywhere, and it was like constantly being advertised. And of course, nobody watched the show, and it failed after like a season. And then they had a big fire sale, I remember in Vancouver, actually, of selling all of the props. And like it became a joke. And I felt like, my empathetic side felt bad for the people involved in making that show. That the CBC had kind of led them to believe that this heavily subsidized, heavily government promoted cultural product might actually be a hit, but it wasn't. It was a phony kind of simulacrum of success. And that just seems to me like that would be really upsetting and would just kind of make you bitter and feel like disliked and rejected by the public. So I just have always thought that government has no business being in the creative realm at all, in the artistic realm. It's just wrong on every level, morally as well as materially.
Yeah, it's funny because like, you ever Train 48? Remember that show?
No,
The entire show took place in like what was It was supposed to take place in like a GO train cart. I don't know how long it was on air for, but that was completely publicly funded, and everyone just made fun of it. Like it was just the worst show on television. Shit creaks happens sometimes, right? Like, and you should give props to the Canadian shows. But the weird is that the CRTC, which by the way isn't mandated to do anything with the digital space, in their name itself, they are not. They weren't intended. It didn't exist. And so in an attempt to actually modernize, which would probably be something like taking traditional legacy media on television and trying to make it seem more like internet, they're taking the internet and they're trying to make it seem more like legacy television.
Yeah,
like they're taking away. They're basically taking the best thing about the internet and they're just trying to water that part of it,
like I am sympathetic to a point with legacy media's complaint that, they have to play by these CanCon broadcasting rules. They have to air these quotas of Canadian content. They have to pay into, the Canadian, I don't know, the media subsidy fund or whatever in order to promote the creation of the Arctic airs of the world, right? And they resent that. They resent that new media doesn't have to do that. And I think that's fair to a point. But to me, the logical solution would be to just lessen the regulation on legacy media. If legacy media just wants to do nothing, like sort of what the professor said, and air American shows all day, I think that should be their right. Right? Like, I don't see why this isn't an opportunity to realize that the old regulation model has failed. It has not achieved its stated aims. It has not created this great renaissance of Canadian cultural products. It has done just the opposite. And that this is obviously going to fail equally hard if we try to apply it to digital media. So I don't understand why this isn't just a moment to just kind of like, just kind of declare the experiment failed, dramatically lessen the powers of the CRTC rather than expand them, and try to enter a new era of Canadian content that is more market driven and is more trusting of consumers to make their own choice and to create a Canadian cultural life that is more organic and natural. Because we know when Canadians are left to their own devices, Canadians will become successful regardless. It's not like that Canadian content has to be forced. I think that YouTube has shown that Canadians are more than capable of making very successful, very audience engaging content when they're not told what precisely they have to make, or they're not told that they have to dance to a certain government tune in order to be certified as Canadian enough, right? I think that this is it's just such a failed moment, and it reflects two things. It reflects like just the limited imagination of government and sort of the Ottawa political class and regulatory class in general, and it reflects sort of just the power of special interests over the lawmaking process, the degree to which when government gets out of bed and says, what should our digital strategy be, the voices they listen to are these entrenched kind of old guard media lobbyists who have been in bed with the government for so long, who are propped up by the government, who know nothing except for an ultra regulatory environment that is created on their own terms. And then at the end of the day, these are the people that are ultimately determining what government's priorities are and what kind of laws are written or not written. And I think, when I was at committee, you saw that in full flower. I was the only witness that opposed this bill, and everybody else was in some ways reflective of sort of entrenched interest groups who were, of course, all for it because they're used to living in a system where, of course, laws are written for their benefit. Who else would they be written for?
Yeah, no, exactly. I've said this before, but I've never, in 20 years that I've been doing independent stuff with a bunch of failures, some successes, or whatever, I never once went, am I going to get some free money to fund this shit? I never even thought of it. I never thought of trying to work the grant system ever. I was like, it was just this mysterious thing in the background that existed, but I didn't, it was a political reason. I wasn't like, I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet. I just never even thought of it. Like, it just didn't even cross my mind. I just wanted to do it myself, and I knew it existed, and it just, it made me kind of, I asked Nathaniel Erskine Smith, the MP, the Liberal MP for the beaches, and I'm like, level with me. if the CRTC, if the building and all its people just disappeared overnight, it'd like be a lot better for all of us. It's like maybe. And it doesn't help
Absolutely.
that you put a telecom CEO, as the chair of the CRTC. Like, what course they're going to like side with legacy media and make life harder for us. But what are you doing now? Where can people find you? And just let them know what you're up to and where they can find you and where they can find your content.
Yeah, so I mean, as I've alluded to, I'm a YouTuber. I make a video for youtube.com every single Saturday. If you just type in JJ McCulloiugh, you'll find my channel, or if McCullough is too complicated, you can just type in JJ Canada and I will pop up, because I'm one of the big shots in sort of the Canadian space, again, without any government propping up at all. And then I also do write a weekly column on Canadian politics for the Washington Post. So I'm part of the Global Opinions section, in which they get folks from around the world to comment on the politics of their country. So those are basically my two big contributions to the Canadian conversation.
And for those who don't know, JJ is a really, really good, strong writer. He's one of the best essayists I think that we have in our country. I think that's an amazing gig that you have. I read you all the time, and it's funny because people are familiar. My audience seems to be familiar with you. First of all, one person was like, "Tell him to say a boot," because apparently you say it like the way that Canadians say it. I don't, like, don't get mad. Do you say it like that?
It's a little offensive, but yeah.
The person saying it was Canadian as well. That helps. Rob, are you really offended by that?
I don't know. I mean, it gets a little tiresome, I think, sometimes when people are just like making fun of the way you talk, right? I mean, it's like being made fun of the way you look, right?
I didn't hear it. I heard you say the one. In fact, I got to tell you, I've never heard any Canadian say a boot my entire life.
Well, a lot of Canadians, but see, I disagree with that. I think a lot of Canadians do say it, and a lot of Canadians are just somewhat in denial about just like how strong their accents are, right? And it's because people make fun of me for doing it that I actually hear it a lot more in other people, because it makes me a little.
I think he was busting your balls in a playful way. I think what he was saying is that, because I'm pretty sure he's a fan of yours. And I think he was just being playful. I'm sorry, man. I apologize. On behalf of Acosta in the comments, I apologize.
It's fine. But
JJ McCullough, thanks for joining us, man. I really appreciate it. Oh,
thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
No, I'm not. Did you want to continue that last thought there? Because I wasn't trying to kick you off.
No, I was just saying, check out my YouTube channel. I've got lots of fun videos.
Yeah, well, please do. And again, he's a great writer. Check him out on the Washington Post, where he writes the Canadian politics column. And JJ McCullough, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good day. For making JJ a little uncomfortable. Now, I think I probably butchered the context a little bit there, but it's fascinating to hear an academic like Michael Geist and then an actual entertainer like talk about this stuff, because it's literally coming. And we're going to continue to talk about it. I have a senator, Leo Mukakis, I think pronounce his last name, coming up at the end of about it. He's a conservative senator who made one of the best speeches ever when the Senate was debating Bill C-10 last year, and it was brilliant. And everything that he was saying is the same thing that Michael Geist was saying, and the same thing that McCullough was saying. And I think it's just really important for people to pay attention to this stuff. They are trying to do this underhand government by asking the Senate to study the bill at the same time that the House is, so that it can be fast-tracked. They're also limiting study time, and they're also not certain details of the bill to be revealed until after it receives royal assent from the Senate. So this is another one of those attempts by the Trudeau government to just be as ridiculous and Orwellian as this we can be. I don't understand the gain of it all, except possibly to hold on to votes in Quebec. That is another thing that I learned from Michael Geist, because a lot of these organizations that rely on this grant program are from Quebec. So we'll see what happens. Tomorrow on Blackballed, I have Rasta Phil. Rasta Phil, met 10 years ago, and we just hit it off. I think it was weed that made us hit off, to be perfectly honest with you. And the reason why I say this is because I find it really interesting when a person who has a celebrity as one of their close friends doesn't use that friendship to get work, but that friendship ends up through almost no fault of his own to receive work. So in other words, people come up to him and offer him stuff because his best friend is Mark Wahlberg. So he's one of the most interesting cats. He's an actor. He's doing a movie right now with Halle Berry. He's an entrepreneur, and he's Mark Wahlberg's best. So and he's also my buddy. So we're gonna have him on the show tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Oh no, wait, tomorrow at 7. I'll put up a promo, and I'm looking forward to that. Again, we're gonna have Senator Liam, I believe, on Thursday or Friday, and a couple other things that I will announce either today or tomorrow. But either way, I appreciate everyone watching. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time on Blackballed.
Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed. Blackballed.